meant that bats would get into the top and then just pee all over them, which, as we ascertained, destroyed them sometimes, which meant that we had gaps in the data set, which was not ideal. So we lost many a sensor to bat pee, essentially. So even though the ambient ones on the outside often were in a bag that was completely saturated in water, because it rained so much that summer, they were fine. So it seems that bat pee has corrosive properties. So that was a bit of a problem, and we do have some gaps in the data. Also, lots of sensors were removed by birds. So you can see on this photo here a sensor hanging out. This was a classic thing that we found, particularly with some of the trees. So you come to download the data and you'd see it hanging out. Thankfully it was on wire, so we didn't really lose them, which was good. And often you could see where they've been pecked at by the birds, who seemed quite tenacious, because some of these sensors were really high up in roosts, so they really must have gone out of their way to get these sensors out. So that, of course, meant that we couldn't necessarily use that data once it had been removed. And this is an example here. So here we've got a roost that becomes occupied by a bird. So in the middle, everything's fine, it's going all right. And then you get here, and birds are entering. So you can generally tell the bird pattern because it's the opposite to the bat pattern. So the temperature increases during the night and decreases during the day. And then you can see at some stage over here, it ejects the sensor and leaves it hanging outside, and the sensor then roughly mirrors the ambient temperature as it's hanging out there. So you kind of don't have to ignore a large section of data. So that was a problem. Interesting to see the graphs nonetheless, but a bit of a problem data-wise. So as I mentioned before, it would be great in further work to get a much larger sample, so that we can do a bit more comparison work between different species, different times of year, etc., etc. And it would also be good if we could find some way of making the sensors not break when they were peed on. So we did try and cover them in things like plastic. Nothing seemed to work at that point. Cling film didn't work. We had to be careful as well, because you don't want that to interfere too much with the temperature reading itself. If you're insulating it too much, it's not going to necessarily be as accurate. So we didn't find a way of making them bat-pee-proof. So more work needs to be done on that, otherwise you'll just lose loads of sensors. Also, something that I'm really quite keen on is looking at the interaction between the bats and the birds a bit more. So it did seem like we had quite a lot of birds in the roosts, and that did make me think that maybe they're taking up some of the really good bat roosts, and that could have a detrimental effect on the bats in the woodland, if all the roosts are being used by birds. And maybe that affects which roosts the bats select, because they might go for one and find a bird is in it, and then they have to use a slightly suboptimal one. So it would be really good to know how much of an influence those birds are having on the bats. And everyone thinks, oh yeah, it's really negative, and birds sometimes predate on bats. There have been cases of great tits pecking at bats within roosts. And bats are, kind of bottom of the chain. They're not really able to defend themselves that much, especially if they're in a state of torpor. So it's generally thought it's not great. It's not a great impact that the birds might have on the bats. But then again, you do get some cases where the birds actually help the bats. I mean, not least from the actual woodpecker holes in the first place, but particularly in one of our roosts, actually, from one of the graphs that you saw earlier with the bats in occupation, my favourite graph. That roost was used by nuthatches each year earlier on in the season, and then they left and the bats occupied it. And actually, the nuthatches had put mud around the hole. I don't know if you've ever seen that with nuthatches. And that means that it might actually be a better roost when the bats come to use it, because it's got a smaller hole, which is anti-predators effectively, and perhaps is more insulated. So they might actually sometimes have a positive impact. And I know that in the wood, previously you've put bird boxes up where there were bat boxes to try and reduce competition. As far as I'm aware, that's been fairly successful. So perhaps, depending on what more research is done, it might be a good idea to put bird boxes on some of the trees that have really good natural roosts. Potentially might reduce competition an idea. Also, it might be good if somehow we landed loads of money to get some pit tags and do some research with that, so that we can actually count bats as well. So that would enable us to put detectors and tags on bats that we find, and we could have the kind of detectors, as it were, in the natural roosts and the artificial roosts as well, and that might enable more of a direct comparison between those occupations too. So that would be quite interesting, and it would be, like we were saying earlier, really good to be able to directly compare the natural roosts versus the boxes, because the natural roosts that are in high occupation do appear to be really, really, really stable. So, just to kind of note at the end here, this is the temperature graph for the box that I mentioned, the repair sensor in earlier as a bit of a punt. It's one of the hibernation Schwegler, I think it's a 1FW type, so I don't know how much you know about bat boxes, but it's quite chunky, isn't it? It's about that big.
Bigger than that.
Bigger than that.
25 kilos.
Yeah, it's heavy. They've done a bat box check. They're big, they're heavy. And they're meant to be really good. They're kind of posited as one of the bee's knees of the bat boxes. And as you can see from this temperature graph, the temperature insulation, as it were, doesn't seem to be amazing. It's not as bad as the worst roost that we had, but it's not that stable. It's not amazing. So it sort of makes you think about, how good these boxes really are. That was just one box, and it's meant to be quite a good one. But one of the advantages of those boxes are, because they're so big, you can get so many bats into them. So they might like them purely really because of the size rather than the properties of the box itself. And that means that loads of them can go in and warm it up. Or potentially if it's in the winter and it's not got much insulation, it might be quite cool, which might be quite good for them if they're in hibernation, if they're in torpor. So that's something that's a bit more to look into really, that might not be as great as you think. Also, my theory on this is that Bechstein's bats that are present in the woodland are kind of really associated with semi-natural ancient woodland. And they seem to really like stable temperatures from previous studies, and also even from my study, with the little bit of data that you can see. They're the ones that like those really stable temperature roosts. And I know one of Matt's bugbears is that the Bechsteins aren't using the boxes in Fine-Mere as they are in some of the other woodlands in the UK. So perhaps it's simply because there's quite a lot of good, stable, natural roosts in the woodlands, and they don't need to go to potentially suboptimal roosts like the boxes. It might just be a really good place for them to live because they've got such great buffered, stable roosts. So that's just one theory of mine. In terms of implications, obviously it's just one small study, so we can't massively generalise or make any big changes. But it does potentially bring up the importance of water sources. Now, I'm not totally convinced of the water source importance from just this study, because I basically had to take measurements from two main ponds that were just outside the woodlands, because during the summer all of the streams within the woodland are dried up, everything's dry. But there might be pockets, smaller ponds, other areas where the bats are using water, which I didn't measure. So that is definitely a limitation and something to consider. Other studies have found that something as small as a cattle trough might actually be an important water source to a bat. So it is, I would take that finding tentatively, but it does match other findings that, of course, water is an important resource for the bats because they do use it to drink from, and there are high densities of insects normally associated with it for food. So we just need to bear in mind that water is important. And I know when I spoke to BBAL before, they said that they might be doing some dam maintenance and some dam works within the wood to try and improve the water resources. I don't know, do you know anything that's happening with that? It was supposed to be happening in the autumn if it was going to happen. I don't know, it was all a bit of a maybe. But depending on what's happening with that, if the water availability has changed within the woodland, this might actually impact the roost selection by the bats. So that might change things this coming year if the water has changed. Also, it does highlight roosts that we have that are known natural roost trees. So just from looking at particularly the radio tracking data, you can see that some of the bats seem to go back to the same trees year after year, and actually sometimes the same week of each year they will then choose to go back. So one of the most occupied roosts, it was always the same week that they would go back and use that tree. So there is some kind of inter-annual fidelity, and also species fidelity, certain species using species trees. So it is important that we don't just go and log them down, or change the immediate habitat in the vicinity of those trees by doing some heavy coppicing suddenly or something like that. So it's important to try and protect those known roost trees and be a bit sensitive to their management around it, perhaps. Although obviously this study focused specifically on fine mealwood, we like to think of the bigger picture as ecologists, don't we? So it's part of the landscape. It's connected to the other woodlands within the Burnwood Forest area. The bats are flying across to those other woodlands. We know from radio tracking that they're using certain trees on farmland and hedgerows between those woods, and that they are travelling across them, the Bentons in particular, which are travelling quite far. So it's important to think of this wood within the context of the broader woodland and think about how we manage it as a whole. And this kind of brings me on to HS2. I know it's controversial, but HS2 is due potentially to carve its way through the Burnwood Forest area. So there will be some habitat loss and at least some impact of that. So these kinds of studies can be quite good when put together to provide a lot of information to try and help our bat species when this potentially happens. So, for instance, we know that Bechsteins aren't particularly using the boxes, so putting up a load of boxes, if we take down some of their trees, isn't necessarily going to help them that much. Potentially, doing some tree surgery might be better, who knows. So things like that can actually potentially help to mitigate the impacts of these sort of developments so that we can do the best job we can for our wildlife. Yeah, that brings me to the conclusion. So, so from the study, we can see that bats seem to select roosts that were near to water, that were far away from other known tree roosts, and essentially had a warm and stable microclimate inside. It would be good to do a bit of work on humidity as well, because other studies have shown that this can be quite an important feature, because being in a roost can help stop so much water evaporation. Unfortunately, because we had to wrap the foam around the sensors to minimise to minimise those, we couldn't really use the humidity data because that would have impacted it. So it'd be good to get some other humidity sensors maybe and do a bit more work on that, because that could be a really important interaction with the temperature to get a sense of the microclimate as a whole. But yes, they were using a warm, stable roost the most. This could be linked to availability, as I mentioned before. So the relative importance of the factors that they're using to select their roosts might change depending on how available those roosts are. And also the implications. So I mentioned that we need to kind of maintain our water sources and think about that within the woodland, and also to protect our key known roosts from any bad effects that might happen from, say, coppicing or something. And finally, potentially, if you take a whole bunch of studies together and look at the data that you have, this can actually be really useful to inform for development projects and to mitigate any negative impacts. So thank you very much, particularly to all the volunteers that helped me out, of course Matt and Hannah, and my professor. So let me know if you've got any questions.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
I've got a question.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm completely unfamiliar with the sensors you used.
With the sorry?
With the sensors.
Okay, yeah.
But are they integral recorder sensor, or is it a remote sensor on the?
So what they are is
Describe it to me.
they're a little, that's fine. So they're called an eye button. They're a little sensor that's about this big, about a coin size. And you put them in the roost, you program them on the computer first to take what readings you want. So I took readings every half an hour, and they can store just over, well, around about 2,500 readings. And so you can work out how many you can get from that. Then you leave them in the roost and they collect data, but you can't access that data
So
remotely, as it were.
the actual sensing element is within this button.
Yes, it's
So when
within
you
that
wrapped it
unit.
up, did you check the attenuation of your wrapping?
In terms of the
The data, did you check when you wrapped them to reduce the crystal clock noise? You wrapped them up.
yeah.
Did you actually measure the difference between wrapped and unwrapped to measure the attenuation? Because obviously that
We did,
Yes, and we did it again as well when we did it.
And was it as significant?
It did minimise it a lot.
No, sorry,
So-
not the noise element,
Oh,
but
the
the
temperature.
measurement element. You must have attenuated the measurements.
Yes, I think you.
yeah, we
did.
did.
Yeah.
Danny was very kind, and we went into CEH in Wallingford. And we
That was
looked
for noise, for the ultrasound, but it's about whether
when we did it, the temperature sensors were also looking at how quickly if the temperatures, and there was a very, very slight time lag. So the sensors always reach the same temperature, unwrapped or wrapped. There was a very, very slight time lag in the two graphs when you compared wrapped and unwrapped, but it was tiny. It was.
And what criteria did you use to actually choose those particular sensors? Because they obviously had the noise element problem. Did you look at other sensors to use?
Well, it was based on availability for my study, to be honest, of what we could have, and we already had those. I think we'd actually bought them before that paper came out discussing the
Yeah,
emissions.
they were a nice sort of size, handy to put in
Yeah.
the roost. Other people and researchers use tiny tags, which are actually quite a big, like old film canister size, quite big things to put into a bat box or a tree roost. So the idea was we wanted to do something very small, and if they hadn't have been wrapped, they would have been really
Yeah.
small.
I was
Hannah
offered
only
the
found
use-
out about the influence potentially of the noise of the tags that we used a week before they were due to go in, so it was embarrassing.
But then the first bat box check we did do, we had two bat boxes side by side, one with a sensor in covered and one with a sensor in not covered, and the bats were using the bat box with the sensor in uncovered. So there was actually, you could argue they'd selected the one with
That was the
the...
signal then for them. Maybe
bizarre.
you don't throw them in and don't bother them.
But it was still a risk because it had been identified.
Did
I
Tiny
was
Tag
offered
also
the.
maybe into ultrasound?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I was offered the use of some larger ones that were kind of like that long, tubular, but to be honest, we really struggled to even get that size into the tiny space at the top of the roost, so I think for us size was actually really important. But I used them from availability, to be honest.
I just it went through my head. Why weren't you? Probably it comes down to cost, but you know there are a myriad of industrial thermocouple sensors, but they are.
It came down to cost.
Yeah.
As part of my research, which these were then used for Debbie's research, I was putting them in 40 roosts, and so
Yeah.
you know the tiny tags are £30 each. 40 times 30 is a lot more.
You're talking a factor of 100 then, difference in the cost. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite significant.
So, Debbie, what was the comparison between you mentioned earlier that the big boundary oak was used earlier in the year, and then the nuthatch one was used. Was that the one you were talking about that was occupied? Yeah, but was that consistently occupied later? And what was the comparison between that temperature regime and the boundary oak?
There was very little difference. So the boundary oak that was
Really?
used earlier in the year was probably, as you can see from the graphs, the most stable and was really stable. And you can imagine, I mean, it's not a big tree, isn't it? The insulation, the
Right
thickness
up
of the
there,
bark.
isn't it?
Yeah,
Massive.
that was a question I had. Do you think there was a difference between the temperature inside the roots, the more stable ones, were just the bigger trees?
Quite
Was
possibly, yes, but not all the
But
time.
that nuthatch one, see, that's the curious thing about that
Quite
nuthatch.
stable.
When you compare the interior of those two roosts, one is a hole which then goes up really quite high, and the nuthatch roost you can virtually put your finger in and poke the bats
Yeah.
because they're so
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
So I wondered whether that
Yeah.
was. And so, this is just, this is not interpretation, but it's just the impression that you get. My impression was that the boundary oak was more stable, and so therefore
It
that had
was
some
the
importance
most
to be
stable.
used earlier in the year. Because the nuthatch one as well, earlier in the year, that had
So-
a nuthatch in it, didn't it?
Yeah. So
So-
this is the nuthatch roost,
Okay.
and you can see before the bats are entering in it how stable it is. So it is really stable.
Yeah.
And how big's the tree? Is it? Picture which one that is.
The cavity itself is not
It's
big.
not
It's not, so it's
massive.
probably that. Isn't it?
Yeah. It's quite filled.
It's not. It's
The
not.
distance between the edge of the tree and then the inside of the cavity isn't, it's
No,
not like.
it's you could literally put your finger and poke the
Yeah.
back so
But
that
that
goes to the
doesn't mean
surface.
it's got quite a thick kind of bark bit around it. Yeah, the back of it is quite well insulated. I mean, there was that birch one. I mean, they're predominantly roosts, it's worth mentioning. But we did have a birch one that was, well, it looked terrible, didn't it, for a roost? It looked like the reject roost. But it was basically had a massive crack in it, and that was not, as you might expect, very good insulation-wise, but still used. But yeah, the most stable roost were the most.
It wasn't used for many days though, was it? It was generally the bats. It might have been that they, when they were tagged, they just went to the nearest one of those because those were quite close to
Yeah.
the mist netting site, wasn't it? They might have just shot up into there and felt uncomfortable for a day or so.
Some of them I don't know though, they don't seem to be particularly good roosts, and you do wonder why they're being used. Like there does seem to be a combination of factors. I think that's the important thing to get from it. It doesn't seem to just be one thing that's making the bats use the roosts. And it could well be to do with time of year and availability of those roosts and things using other roosts nearby.
But the boundary was the most frequently used, was it?
Yeah.
And that was quite, was it consistently used earlier in the year?
Consistently used earlier in the year, yeah.
And the nuthatch roost was used consistently selection. Well, that's interesting in
So
itself,
there was,
that
I think
temporal
from
patterns.
what I remember, there was a crossover as well, that there were odd periods of occupation later, but predominantly, yeah.
The boundary oak was also used by naturalists.
Yeah.
And Steve, he found a hibernating brown long-eared, two hibernating brown long-ears in that nuthatch one.
Oh, right.
Before it was filled up by the nuthatches. So it shows us, crossover of
Yeah,
species
there's
in different
definitely
times of
crossover.
year.
I'd be really interested in looking at the time of year that they're being used a bit more.
Similarly, the maternity roost, the main maternity roost that we didn't look at
Yeah.
because we were worried about sensitivity, that seems to be used again a similar time of year from the HS2 studies and
Yeah.
from our radio tracking studies. That seems to be used at a similar time of year, sort of that critical late June, early July period.
But what also made me think about that, I was thinking about that earlier, was that was used quite a lot with them bats travelling from the radio tracking data to the boundary oak, travelling back and forth, during particularly this year we found them. And they're quite a distance from each other. They're not particularly close. It does make you wonder, there must be something really good about those roosts to want to go back between them. Because they are quite far.
I've had a few discussions with various batty people about the importance of boundary oaks, funny enough, in relation to Becksteins. And there's a real big thinking that trees outside woodlands, for example, that sometimes the woodlands have been designated as SACs, are really important for Becksteins. And it's interesting to think, is it the tree outside the woodland that's the significance, or is it the tree that's got really good thermal properties that's really important? But then talking about whether then that has ramifications for if other SACs are designated, whether you have to designate it the woodland and then also the trees outside the woodland in boundary hedgerows, because then they also like an important contributing factor to the designation of an SAC. It's very interesting.
Just instinctively, I know you thought, David, but I would have thought it's the width and the size of the tree. Because you look at the three external, or close to external Becksteins roosts that we've found. One was in the middle of a field, another one was in the middle of a field, and the other one was on the was not a big tree, it was not a massive tree, and then the other one where the one by the silver birch that we used like 45 or something like that, quite a large number of exercise the previous year.
Yeah.
That was not a big tree either.
No.
But that, and both of those two were
They all
inside the
tend
wood,
to be
quite a
Yeah,
long way
that's
inside the
this is
wood.
it. You think it's people are identifying it that boundary trees are really important, but maybe it's
But they were well buffered,
to do with
temperature-wise, they were well buffered, smaller trees, so well buffered in terms of the trees around them. So
And
maybe that would
actually,
have an impact.
that reminds me of something that I did find. So I did look at, I took a lot of aerial shots from the roost. From the roost entrance, I place the camera up like that and take a shot of the sky, and then I'd analyse that for the coverage of leaves and canopy, and to see how open those roost entrances were. So I did this in peak summer when you've got the most foliage, and all of them had over 80% coverage. So they were all quite shaded by the canopy. None of them were overly exposed. There has been quite a lot of research that shows that that's like south-facing entrances. They like them to be exposed. They like them to be in the sun. But all of these were over 80. I mean, I just couldn't make any comparisons. They were all almost completely covered, which probably has something to do with some of them being quite stable. But then others weren't. I just let them fall about sunlight. But yeah, that just reminded me of how they were quite well sheltered.
interesting.
Looking at these, you know, always lots of questions that come out when you study them. It makes you wonder why they use the boxes at all.
Well, yeah, it's my theory of why the Beckstones aren't using the boxes.
Well, maybe, yeah, but then, you know, and I've been to lots of other woodlands where they use them, albeit they seem to, well, some of them they tend to favour the bigger boxes. Certainly the
Some of the Beckstones
Beckstones
boxes though that we've seen have been in direct sunlight. Some of it.
Yeah, I mean,
They must
Maybe it's just
fluctuate
the
massively.
resources around, you know, if there's not
yeah,
enough
I
of these
think
big
roost
old trees, maybe just
availability
like,
must have a big
It
influence.
must,
I mean,
yeah.
they'll just use whatever if they have to, you know.
But
It's
that
like
was-
us, you can't buy a house on the market, you just get what you can.
It does, that's something I thought was really interesting from what you said tonight, is that consistency of pattern, movement pattern between several trees, and certainly there's another one, you know, the one we
did that mock-up filming to, you know, the one with Steve had, the one you climbed and endoscoped, right, with the concrete dustbin on. That one, that there were early in the year, there's constant movement, which I think it's number 4, I think it is, or something like that. There's a constant movement. Well, there seems to be a consistent movement between the boundary oak and that one.
Okay,
The boundary oak
yeah,
and that
yeah.
one. And that's at the top of the tree, isn't it? And the diameter is probably no more than that, but it's quite deep in, I suppose. But it's just culture. It might be just, you know, they consistently use the trees because they work for them.
It's also worth saying that like you say, you've been talking about kind of inside the roost and everything, kind of put your finger in it, is that they're all very widely ranging in terms of shape inside the actual roost. It's one of the things that I found quite hard, was I've tried desperately was much try and get internal roost measurements of capacity and those kind of dimensions. And I just had to give up in the end. I took height and depth and things in the entrance, took what I could, but I thought it was meaningful, because I felt like some of the other measurements weren't meaningful, because most of the studies use the dimensions that they've got to then calculate the capacity of a roost as a sphere. But as far as I can tell, not really any one of our roosts was a sphere, and didn't really fit that at all.
That's another thing. I was just thinking about, just thinking things through as you were suggesting. The smaller ones later in the, were they used later in the small? Well, the ones internal ones, the ones in the external parts of the wood, are big old trees. Those three, well, I know it's not a big sample size, but three big old trees. But then there's the two smaller trees, so the nuthatch one and the one by the silver birch, and then there's your one, Keith, the one you found, that's right in the middle of the wood, isn't it? That diameter.
Yeah,
That was, there was like a black box, you know. But so, can you remember? You know, the doorbell when we found the doorbell was that one, you know, the one. Was that still really buffered? Because that thickness can't have been more than that.
To be honest, that was used so much, and